welcome back at the top of the hour to our BJU Press You Got It Mom event. I don't know about you, but that last presentation just spoke to my heart. As a matter of fact, I spent some time last night at 2 a.m., don't ask me why, figuring out how many hours a child would spend in school. It's over 15,000 hours from K-5 through high school. And you don't want your kids exposed to that type of secular curriculum for 15,000 hours. And now we know why. That was just amazing, Janelle. Thank you so much. And it makes me so thankful for everything that happens here at BJU Press Homeschool to give us that Christian curriculum where we can disciple our kids and not only disciple them but learn with them. So our next guest is a new friend of mine. I want to get her book here, Jamie Erikson. I have to tell you, I went on Jamie's blog, and it's called The Unlikely Homeschool, and I could not get off of it. She is such a wonderful writer and so insightful and so compelling. Now, I tell you that after having been in the homeschooling world for 35 years, and so it's hard for me to say this is compelling because I've spent 35 years reading homeschool stuff. So I'm so excited to hear what Jamie has to tell us. So she is a wife and a mother of 5. I'll tell you, neither one of these girls look like they're old enough to have that many kids, the ages that they are. And her recently released book is Homeschool Bravely. You can, of course, get it on Amazon. I have to read you the subtitle because the subtitle is so good. How to Squash Doubt, Trust God, and Teach Your Child with Confidence. And don't you love the cover? Love the cover. Her husband, Jamie's husband, was homeschooled. Now, I don't know if she'll tell the story today. If not, you'll have to go to her blog and find out the rest of it. And did not want her to homeschool. He got a cold, and he gained a new perspective on homeschooling. So for those of us who have had husbands who were reluctant in the beginning, we didn't know to pray for colds. And another thing about Jamie is she has her BS in elementary education. And so I know she struggled, like a lot of my friends who are trained teachers, to figure out this new homeschooling world. I think she'll be sharing a lot of her wisdom for us that she learned in her teacher days and then in her homeschool days. So Jamie, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. Just skimming your book. I'm ordering it today. I can't wait to read it. I've already gained so much wisdom from being with you. So thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Well, we're going to be talking this afternoon about homeschooling when you are one crazy day away from crisis. And I thought I would start by taking an unofficial poll to see how many of you feel like you're in a crazy day or perhaps a crisis. But then I thought, these are homeschool moms, and so that one kind of goes with the other. So instead, I'd actually like to start with a story, if I could. This is a story that has to do with my son, and his name is Reese, and he's 13 now, but this is a story that goes all the way back 10 years ago when he was 3. And of course, at 3 years old, he was not officially homeschooling, but he would often like to climb up onto the homeschool table with his older sister and kind of elbow into her space. So one day, when he was 3, he and I were standing at the dining room table, and we were staring with open, gaping mouths. And he had tears brimming the little corners of his eyes because he was only 3 at the time, and he didn't really understand all that was happening. And golly, I was 30 at the time, and even I didn't get it. But we stood there, and even in my limited experience, we felt really helpless and hopeless as we were watching all the struggle. But even in my limited experience, I knew that although we could help was certainly within our power. If we did help in all the struggle that we were watching, we probably would have crippled or limited any potential success. But really, how could I explain that to my son? As we sat watching this jar, as that little butterfly began to emerge, and we sat watching the jar in all the anguish desperately wanting to just reach out and end what seemed to us like strife and suffering. I don't know if you've ever seen a butterfly emerge from a chrysalis, but it is really painful to watch. And we gathered around that old pickle jar that afternoon, anxiously watching as that butterfly, which happened to be our summertime science project, wrestle its way out into the world. And its once protective shell was now kind of becoming an anchor, weighing it down. And the butterfly, we watched as it kind of writhed and wriggled, desperately trying to free its wings. And it was a violent dance. But it was a dance choreographed by a creator who knows all the hidden and silent secrets of nature, even the ones we didn't understand. And surely it was only a matter of moments before he completely hatched, but at the time, to us, it seemed like hours before those limp wings emerged from their captivating shell. The process looked really painful and, quite frankly, kind of pointless. We could have just easily, like I said, just reached out and peeled off that chrysalis and that shell, just revealing the butterfly's wings and freeing him from all that struggle. But we didn't. We couldn't. And I just leaned into him and I said, he needs to build his muscles, buddy. It was really just my simple explanation, my 3-year-old explanation for what I knew to be true. Let me give you a little science lesson, because you're homeschool moms, and I'm assuming you kind of geek out on these things like I do too. So it's in the pushing and the pulling that a butterfly actually releases this yellowish blood called hemolymph. And it releases from its giant abdomen and spreads out into its wing veins, allowing those wings to expand and eventually dry. And without that struggle, there would be no flight. Now, watching the struggle as a bystander was kind of difficult, but I knew that the struggle would help our butterfly grow into what it was supposed to be. And if I took away the struggle, he wouldn't be able to fly. And it's the same way with homeschooling sometimes, mamas. You can't always opt out of the struggle for you or for your child. Sometimes you just have to sit in the discomfort of it for your good and for theirs. And dare I say it, more often than not, there really is a someday point to this right now pain. Now, at the risk of pouring salt into maybe an open wound, I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that because you're here today, you're facing some kind of struggle, and that burden has become, that struggle has become a burden on your attempt to homeschool, because struggle just seems to be the common denominator of humanity, doesn't it? Jesus put it this way. He said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble." So whether you find yourself in a momentary calm or in the very center of a storm right now, one thing's for certain: crazy is going to find you. Struggle is synonymous with the world. And you might be only one crisis away from crazy, and you can't seem to see how you can keep the wheels spinning on your homeschool any longer. But don't forget that Christ's best moments of teaching were in chaos too. Let's think about that for a minute. In crowded homes, along the lake shore, and really, even in the center of God's house, Jesus was familiar with messy living, wasn't he? He had to teach stubborn people who refused to listen. And he too had to fight to be heard above crying babies and noisy animals. Does that sound at all familiar to anybody else? Is it just me? The smell of dirty diapers was masked only by the pungent odor of rotting fish being washed ashore at his feet. He was surrounded by needy people clinging to him. He was faced with death and disease and hopeless situations at every turn, and still he taught. In fact, those were the very things that he used to teach some really big lessons in really gentle ways. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's really easy to sometimes get angry or upset with God for the struggles of this world or the difficulties that I'm facing, including homeschool. And maybe you feel the same way. We're only human, and doubt sometimes comes with flesh. But aren't you so glad that you can't always figure out God's ways or his plans? I know I am. If I had to if I could somehow Sherlock Holmes my way to figure out God's plans, if I had to serve a God who I alone could figure out what's going on, and I could put all of his plans and his ways into my teeny tiny brain, I wouldn't want to serve a God like that. I can't always figure out his plans and his ways. But I'm really happy for those unanswered questions, and I'm content with my ignorance because I know that his ways are so much higher than my ways, and that is good. Now, I love homeschooling, and I'm assuming you do too, but sometimes I only like it for about 0 seconds. I remember one day, not long ago, I ended our school time feeling really mentally wounded. I had one son, I caught him in a tangled web of lies, and I had to spend most of the day walking him through restoration and redemption and repentance. And then I listened as another little boy used up all of his words on me until I thought my ears were going to bleed. And then it was around that same time that my daughter had started a ministry project, which later turned out to be so wonderful in her life and in the lives of others, and I'm very grateful for that. But at the time, it took a whole lot more of my help than I was anticipating. And then to top it all off, my laptop decided to boycott math. And I completely understand the boycott because math and I have had a blood feud my entire life. But that day was not a good day for technology to malfunction, even for math. And so there I was. I ended that day feeling very calloused and bruised emotionally, and it would have been really easy in that moment to second guess my decision to homeschool because, quite frankly, I really wasn't seeing any of the fruit of it. Perhaps you have had similar days. If so, I want to just give you a couple of tools in the next few minutes that we have together to help plant your feet firmly so that you don't always feel so fragile on the shaky days. I want you to, first of all, find treasures. Look for those treasures in the darkness. Mama, sometimes the dark days bring about the biggest blessings. I want you to take a look at Isaiah 45:3, which reads, "I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by name." It's often in the darkness, those struggles, that we really do find the best things in life if we're willing to look for them. You know, think about it for a second. Birth only comes from birth pains. And freedom is often the result that we find from war. Gold medals are the reward of grueling work and years of self-denial, right? I found treasures, even in that dark day, because God used my emotional poverty to reveal some really untended places in my heart that I didn't even know were there. He chiseled away at things like impatience, selfishness, and pride to make me more like him. And some days his shaping on me comes by way of a scalpel, but that day kind of felt like a chainsaw. I was a hard lump. But when all was said and done, I was one step closer to the completed me, the me that looks more like him. And I was so spiritually grateful. I may have been mentally wounded, but spiritually grateful. Now, my homeschool is not any more immune to struggle than any of yours is. It's seen more than its share of misery. Several years ago, my kids had to watch as I said goodbye to my dad, who died after a string of strokes. And while in my grief, I would have loved to have just stayed in bed until the end of time. I knew I couldn't, because life had to go on, and homeschooling obviously still had to go on. But fortunately for me, it didn't have to happen with quite the same momentum that it usually did. In fact, it couldn't, because I just didn't have it in me. I had to forfeit some of my original plans and revamp others. And mostly I just found that I was putting one foot in front of the other, just doing the next thing, keeping forward motion as best as I could. Now, it was around that same time that one of my dearest friends in the whole world had to bury her 2-year-old son. And the entirety of his life was spent in and out of hospitals fighting for just one more day. And through those difficult years, his older siblings who were homeschooling got a completely different education than the one their mom had planned for them at the beginning of the year. Their days were spent in waiting rooms and in hospital hallways and eventually in hospice care. And they really did live lifetimes in those 24 months. Illness, death, job loss, spousal abandonment. I visited with moms who have experienced any and all of these. And while their homeschool situations have all been different, and their struggles have all been different, and their specific circumstances have all varied, their survival instincts have all been the same. They all recognize that during that specific season of struggle, they had to pare down and do homeschooling maybe a little bit differently, at least for a while. And guess what, mamas? That's not throwing in the towel. I want you to start to choose delight instead of defeat. If you're in a season of struggle or maybe chaos, don't be ashamed to just undertake the bare minimum. Ask yourself, if my child could only finish one subject today, what do I hope it'll be? And only you can answer that question specifically for your kids in your home. And maybe at this point in the season that you're in, maybe the thought of even completing one subject seems a little unrealistic. So practice specific skills, not subjects. In other words, if introducing maybe long division today just isn't really possible, just review regular division problems for a bit, and then maybe ask your child to rehearse his subtraction facts for a while. And both of those skills will eventually combine to form a foundation of long division. So really, you're just kind of greasing the wheel for some day when life can return to normal, if there is such a thing. Reviewing previously learned lessons is never a waste of time, even if that's all that can happen today in this moment. I also want to encourage you to create a mobile classroom as a way to choose delight instead of defeat. Now, if you, like my friend, find yourself bouncing from this doctor's appointment to that consultation, create a mobile classroom by just packing a few things in a school on-the-go bag. And what that looks like is this. So along with those 1 or 2 essential subjects that you maybe just thought of in your head when I asked you, if you only had a little bit of time in the day, what do you hope to accomplish? Along with those 1 or 2 things, pack a backpack with maybe earbuds and audiobooks, educational board games, a laptop maybe queued up already with an educational documentary, historical biographies and age-appropriate current event magazines maybe. Simple handwork projects if your kids really like to do that or maybe want to learn something new. All of those things can easily be assigned and enjoyed maybe in the car or in the waiting room. They can be started and then stopped and then picked back up again with ease. A couple of years ago, I found myself taking all 5 of my kids on day trips to the big city. And you have to understand, at the time we were living in a teeny tiny town that was very akin to Mayberry. And so we would drive 2 hours to the big city every few months for my daughter's cardiology appointments at a children's hospital. And it was during that time that I never mourned the loss of what I thought school was supposed to be, or even marked those days, those odd days in the casualty column. Instead, I chose to see them for what they really were, a chance to show my kids the treasures in the dark days by teaching through the real lessons of life. And that's the third thing that you can do, is teach from life. That year, for just a nominal flat rate, I bought a reciprocating admissions pass for my entire family, and it gave us entrance to dozens upon dozens of museums and zoos and science centers all around our city, around our state, even around the country. And whenever we had to travel for those doctor's appointments and visits, I planned field trips, both at the start and at the end. So I kind of bookmarked our day, or bookended our day, with some real out-of-the-box learning that we weren't used to. Now, most of the time, we enjoyed a lot of academically heavy places, like those science centers and those living history museums. But sometimes, we just enjoyed the everyday offerings that an urban area had to provide, that we, small town folk just weren't used to. One time, we even found this organic little international market, and we went in there and we were just intending to grab some snacks and get out. But we stayed because we were so fascinated by all these things we'd never seen before. And we went around the market and spent the entire afternoon, and I counted that as school, because my kids had never been to a store like that. It was a day filled with echocardiograms and delicious samples of ensaymada. But you know what? Without the one, we never would have had the other. Now, this is not a call, mamas, to just buck up or get over it, or really even to dismiss the very real pain of your days, or provide a template for you to lay over them. But really, it's to encourage you to relinquish your tight hold of homeschooling in the midst of your difficulty. And in so doing, you're really going to find that delight instead of defeat. And lastly, I just want to encourage you to incorporate an interest-led learning. It's a new approach to teaching, one that requires less of you. And you don't have to do it forever, just for this season, just for this time. During this struggle-filled season, I want you to consider this interest-led learning, which is sometimes called strewing or project-based learning. These two methods are not just helpful during moments of crisis, but really are great for those normal homeschool days that maybe swing around once a year. Strewing, which is sometimes referred to as delight-directed learning, is really what you could call organic school, because it uses a full spectrum of experience to nurture a child's natural curiosity. And then similarly, project-based learning encourages a child to create and experiment, build something in order to discover more about it, and then they're encouraged to share about those discoveries once the project is complete with an audience. And in this case, it would be family or friends, maybe somebody in your co-op. Both of these methods are practically torn from the old children's classic, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, because they use a pre-existing idea or interest to sort of lure a child into learning a new interest or passion. One topic leads to the next, which leads to the next, which leads to the next. And so, like a farmer just strewing out seeds in a field, all you really need to do in order to do this delight-directed education or project-based learning is just toss out a few ideas. Lay out a few interesting items for them to discover. You have to be willing to welcome boredom, and then you can just watch as your child's natural curiosity begins to take over, really growing new areas of interest. So let me give you an example of that in practical living. What does that look like in the everyday trenches of homeschooling? I want you to take Legos, for instance. This is a picture of my son, Finn. And like all 10-year-old boys, my son, Finn, is obsessed with Legos. And so unless he's tasked to do a particular homeschool assignment or a chore, you can always find him buried somewhere down in the basement under a project in the making. And to be honest, I think if he could build himself a little colony of minifigures and declare himself king so that he'd never have to leave the basement, I think that he would. He would construct the world's first plastic monarchy, I think. Now, I could just leave him in the basement, continuing to build his Legos in solitude, or I could use that pre-existing passion of Legos to entice him into something new. And because I'm a homeschool mom, I choose door number 2. Here's where the stirring comes in. I start out by laying out some headphones, some earbuds next to his playing area. And I also place my smartphone there. And on a kid-friendly, I have it scheduled up to a kid-friendly podcast or maybe an audiobook. And I just casually mention to him that he can have some extra time to play and listen to a podcast if he wants to, and he can listen to an episode all by himself. And as the middle child, that's really enticing to him. He can play with the Legos all he wants, just listen to the podcast. And I know as his mom that he loves audio dramas, so he takes the bait. And he sifts through and he finds one about the life of Robert E. Lee. Now, a few minutes into the story, he realizes, hey, this is the same Lee that Mom was talking about when she came back from a whirlwind trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that I had just come back with some girlfriends. I had returned home laden with maps and souvenirs and maps and stories of a nation divided. And we sat on the floor when I came home and we sort of retraced the Turning Point battle. And he had listened pretty intently then. But now, after building and listening and building some more, he's mesmerized. He rushes to our homeschool library, which is upstairs, and he begins culling a stash of Civil War-themed books. And the next hour finds him in this literary retelling of Lee and Grant and their opposing armies. And somewhere in the mix, he stumbles upon Lincoln. And he learns of his love for cats and his insatiable appetite for chicken casserole. And he learns about his presidency, all these little-known facts that he finds in some random presidential trivia book. All these quirky incidental facts of Honest Abe begin to scroll in his mind, and he bursts into a lively discussion about it at the lunch table that day with all of us. He starts to spit presidential potpourri out at us. He says things like, Mom, did you know that Harry S. Truman didn't have a middle name? The S didn't actually stand for anything. And did you know that President William Taft was so overweight, 350 pounds, Mom? He was so overweight that he actually got stuck in the bathtub once. And did you know, Mom, that Ronald Reagan loved jelly beans so much that in 1981, for his presidential inauguration, somebody invented the blue-flavored jelly bean. Do we have any blue-flavored jelly beans, Mom? And he continues on. And after lunch, he gathers some craft supplies and a set of dice, and he spreads them all out on the living room floor with all of this presidential knowledge just bursting from his mind. And he begins to make a homemade game, a presidential trivia game. And he makes question cards and fake money and this elaborate game board filled with colored squares. And with the project in hand, he somehow rallies all of his siblings together to play this homemade game. And while he's playing, someone just happens to turn on another audio drama, and his thoughts drift to Vikings and their European invasions. Like a mouse and a cookie every time. And that is how you strew. But audio dramas aren't the only way to entice your child into learning. I want to just give you a list of some of the simple ways, simple ideas and activities that you can just casually bring in and suggest to your child in order to sneak some learning into even your most struggle-filled days. I'm going to go really quickly. I'm not going to be able to mention them all, but feel free to take a screenshot if you want. Here are some ways that you can encourage your child to learn, even on those difficult days. So some of my favorites are to encourage them to start a blog, to practice those writing skills. Be sure to set the security to lock so that only invited friends and family members can read it. You can also encourage them to create a pet habitat, maybe in a large glass jar like we had done that summer. Hide and seek a geocache in your area if you've never done that. You can also encourage them to open a savings account and keep track of their allowance and their gift money. That's good practice for math. Maybe make several small boats out of various different types of materials and then test the floatability of each. That's always a fun one. Create a floor plan for an indoor fort with a younger sibling and then build it together. Plan a scavenger hunt for that younger sibling by writing or drawing out some appropriate clues. Maybe try to replicate a famous painting together or another artwork. Learn a new handcraft. My daughter loves going on YouTube, finding a new handcraft to learn because she's a 21st century girl. Some other things that you can do. Here's one. This was one of my favorites. Encourage your children to look at a coffee table art book, like of Norman Rockwell. We did this once, and we looked at his illustrations, and we discussed the cultural and the historical significance of each, and that really did open the gamut of conversation together. Maybe create a secret code and encrypt messages together or with family and friends. Listen to a news podcast. Keep records of things in a calendar, like the phases of the moon, maybe plant growth, patterns, weather patterns. If cultivated, one passion can lead to the next that leads to the next. And like a mouse in a cookie, your child will be learning every single time. Educating your kids shouldn't have to drain you or leave you feeling limp, even on the hard days. A child's natural curiosity really can be his best teacher. So that just kind of leaves you there to cheer from the sidelines when you need to on those really hard days. And in this way, homeschooling really can create calm, even on your chaos, even on those chaotic days. However, I want you to know that should you still feel dead to homeschooling because of the struggle that surrounds you right now, remember that God can resurrect anything. Pray and ask Him to resurrect your love for your children if need be, your love for your calling, your commitment. And remember that this one bad day does not define your entire homeschool. You are more than your worst days. Nothing is ever too far gone from His redemptive power. He's always at work, always working, even if it doesn't seem like it. He might seem complacent or sedentary in your situation, but He's not. Remember that Jesus was perfect, and yet God's plans for Him still included a cross. But what did He say as He went there? Not my will, but yours be done. Following God's will to teach your children at home doesn't mean that everything will go exactly as you have planned, but you can be sure that it will always go exactly as He has planned. And lastly, as we close, I want you to just recognize that sometimes the struggle is necessary. You can't always have a quick fix or a 12-step program. Unfortunately, in this world, the devil's play is often distraction. He wants to draw you away from God's good plans by making you feel defeated right in the very midst of them. He wants to use your fears and your faults and your failures to take center stage. But remember Christ's words that we talked about at the very beginning and let them talk you off the ledge. Let's talk about what those words were again. He said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." That "but" is the bridge that spans the gap between the test that you feel you're in right now to the testimony that you will have on the other side of it because of it. Just like you, your kids are going to have to struggle and have fears and faults and failures too. And dare I say it, they're going to fail at school, in the workplace, maybe in relationships, because failure is just a part of this deal that we call living. But don't deprive your struggling one of the failure. That's how he'll grow. That's how he'll learn. No one ever learns nearly as much from all the good stuff of life, right? We all learn more when we're allowed to try and sometimes fail, but encouraged to get back up again. And I know it's hard to watch the struggle, especially as a mama, especially when you know help is within my power to give. But remember this: God didn't miss a stitch when he knit your child together. Not one stitch. And in praying that he keeps all those hard things away from your struggling one, or even expecting that he'll answer such a prayer, is really denying your child the opportunity to be sanctified. In fact, according to 1 Thessalonians 4:3, you're robbing him, or you could be robbing him, of the very will of God. Now, that's not to say that sanctification can only come through struggle, but that it often does. When your kids are allowed to struggle and see God working in that, they begin to stretch their own faith wings. And without the struggle, there would be no flight. One of my dear friends, who's a mom of 10, and she's the author of the book, Why Motherhood Matters. Her name's September McCarthy. She has this to say about your child's struggle. For every little part of your child's life that you try to own or fix for them, you are taking away something from the work and worth of God in their lives. Do you remember the butterfly from my son's science project? He, or maybe it was a she, I don't know. Who can know those things? It took off with a perfect dismount from the branch. It took some time, and it definitely took some struggle. But eventually, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It flew. And had my son or I helped in any way, we would have, had we removed any part of that difficult process, that butterfly surely would have died. The struggle is necessary. Christ's struggle was necessary. And perhaps your struggle is necessary too. But take heart, because the good flight is coming. You've got this, mamas. Thank you so much for joining us this hour. We have one more hour to go. If you join us at the top of the hour, we're going to be fielding some questions. Zan and Janelle and I will be taking your questions of homeschooling, and we'd love to answer them for you. So head on back at the top of the hour.